Long Prairie, Minnesota. September 2012. A 24-year-old man named Michael Jeff Landers sits across from law enforcement officers in a small interrogation room. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. His hands rest on the table, relaxed, unsuspecting. He answered their questions about his social security number, his date of birth, and his family. Everything checks out. Everything is normal. Except nothing is normal. Because Michael Jeff Landers doesn't exist. The man sitting in that chair believes he knows who he is. He believes he knows his grandparents, Raymond and Susan Iddings, the people who raised him with love in rural Minnesota. He believes he understands his own story. He has no idea that his entire life is a lie. The detective slides a photograph across the table. It's yellowed with age, creased at the corners. A 5-year-old boy with innocent eyes stares back from 1994. "Do you recognize this child?" the detective asks. Michael studies the photo. Something flickers in his eyes, recognition, confusion, a distant memory fighting to surface. "That's you," the detective says quietly. "Your real name is Richard Wayne Landers Jr. You were abducted from Indiana 18 years ago. You've been missing since July 29, 1994. In that moment, everything Michael thought he knew shatters like glass. This is the astonishing true story of a family torn apart by love, desperation, and impossible choices. A story of a mother who never stopped hoping. A story that asks the most difficult question of all: can kidnapping ever be an act of love? Welcome to the Found Files, where the missing are never truly gone, and the found are never the same again. If you believe every disappearance hides a second story, hit subscribe right now. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Because this story will travel farther than you think. The summer of 1994 was sweltering in northern Indiana. In the small communities of LaGrange County, places like Wolcottville and Lima, where cornfields stretched to the horizon and everyone knew everyone, life moved at a slower pace. The Spice Girls hadn't yet topped the charts. Cell phones were bulky luxuries. The internet was something most people had only heard about on the evening news. And in this world, where privacy was still possible and disappearing was frighteningly easy, a custody battle was quietly tearing a family apart. Lisa Harter was a young mother trying to find her footing in a complicated world. She had mild developmental disabilities that made some aspects of independent living challenging, but she was far from incapable. She loved her son fiercely, 5-year-old Richard Wayne Landers Jr., a bright-eyed little boy with his whole life ahead of him. She called him Ricky. He was her world. But life has been difficult. There had been a period when Lisa lived in a group home, a supervised living facility that provided support for adults with developmental challenges. The rules were clear: children couldn't live there. So, temporarily, painfully, Lisa had made what she thought was the right choice. She allowed Richard's paternal grandparents, Richard E. Landers and Ruth A. Landers, to take custody of their grandson. It was supposed to be temporary. Just until she got on her feet. Richard and Ruth Landers were older, established members of the community. They had raised their own children. They had resources, stability, and a home. They believed, truly, deeply believed, that they could provide a better life for their grandson than his mother could. And perhaps, in those early days, everyone thought this arrangement would work. Perhaps everyone believed they were doing what was best for the child. But love, as we all know, is complicated. And sometimes the people who love us most can hurt us deepest. Everything changed when Lisa remarried. Her new husband, Richard Harter, was a stable presence. Together, they moved into an apartment, a real home, a place where they could raise a child. Lisa was ready. She had proven herself capable. She had support. It was time to get her son back. In July 1994, she petitioned the court for expanded custody rights. On July 28, 1994, a judge reviewed the case. The evidence was clear: Lisa had done everything asked of her. She had a stable home. She had a supportive spouse. The judge made his ruling: Lisa Harter would receive custody of her son on a trial basis. It was everything she had fought for. Everything she had dreamed of. The court scheduled a pickup for the next day. Lisa would finally bring Ricky home. She went to bed that night with hope in her heart, probably imagining that first moment when she'd hold her son again, when their family would finally be whole. She had no way of knowing that her son was already gone. Dawn breaks over Wolcottville, Indiana. July 29, 1994. Inside the Landers home, Richard E. Landers, age 53, and his wife Ruth, age 49, are awake before sunrise. They move with quiet purpose through rooms they've lived in for years, touching furniture they'll never see again, walking through a door they'll never walk through again. At some point in the previous days, perhaps weeks, they made a decision. A terrible, desperate, irrevocable decision. They would not give up their grandson. They would not let the courts take him away. They would not trust his mother to care for him properly. They would run. Days earlier, they had withdrawn $5,000 from a home equity line of credit. Cash. Untraceable. Enough to start over somewhere new. They had made plans. They had fake identities prepared. They had a destination in mind, somewhere far from Indiana, somewhere they could disappear. Richard E. Landers was a Vietnam War veteran. He understood strategy, preparation, execution. This wasn't an impulsive act. This was a military operation. That morning, they woke 5-year-old Ricky gently. Perhaps they told him they were going on a special trip. Perhaps they told him it was an adventure. Perhaps they said nothing at all and simply dressed him, fed him breakfast, and loaded him into their car. One can imagine the child's excitement: a trip. With Grandma and Grandpa. Maybe they were going to the zoo, or to visit relatives, or on vacation. The adults knew better. They knew exactly what they were doing. They went out for breakfast, one last meal in the community where they'd built their lives. Then they drove away from Wolcottville. Away from Indiana. Away from the court order. Away from Lisa Harter, who at that very moment was probably getting ready, choosing what to wear for the day she'd finally reunite with her son. They drove west and north, toward a new life under new names, with a child who had no idea his entire world was about to change. Hours passed before anyone realized something was wrong. Lisa Harter arrived to pick up her son. The house was empty. The Landers were gone. Ricky was gone. Can you imagine that moment? The confusion turned to concern. Concern turning to panic. Calling their phone, no answer. Knocking on neighbors' doors, has anyone seen them? When did they leave? Where did they go? The sickening realization settled in: they've taken him. They've taken my son. The LaGrange County Sheriff's Department took the call on July 29, 1994. A 5-year-old boy, Richard Wayne Landers Jr., had been taken by his paternal grandparents in violation of a court order. The child was in danger, not from strangers, but from his own family. This was before the Amber Alert system, which wouldn't be implemented nationwide until years later. This was before social media, before cell phone tracking, before the sophisticated missing persons databases that we rely on today. In 1994, if someone wanted to disappear, it was entirely possible. Arrest warrants were quickly issued for Richard E. and Ruth A. Landers. The charges: custodial interference, also known as parental kidnapping. In Indiana, it's a felony to knowingly remove a child from the custody of the legal guardian. But understanding the crime and solving it are two very different things. Detectives interviewed neighbors. Had anyone seen the Landers leaving? Did they mention where they were going? Did they have relatives in other states? They checked financial records. The $5,000 withdrawal was discovered, a clear sign of premeditation. They weren't planning to come back. They contacted the FBI. When a child is taken across state lines, it becomes a federal case. Agents were assigned. The investigation expanded. They issued bulletins to law enforcement agencies across the country. Be on the lookout for Richard E. Landers, white male, age 53, traveling with his wife Ruth, age 49, and their grandson Richard Jr., age 5. Last seen in northern Indiana. Consider them in flight. For weeks, then months, investigators followed leads. A reported sighting in Ohio, false alarm. Someone thought they saw them in Michigan, wrong family. A tip came in from Wisconsin, it led nowhere. The Landers had done what they set out to do, they had vanished. But Lisa Harter refused to give up. Every few days, she called the sheriff's department. Any news? Any leads? Anything at all? The answer was always the same, no, ma'am. We're still looking. We haven't forgotten about your son. But as 1994 turned to 1995, and 1995 turned to 1996, the case grew colder. Active investigations became passive files. The daily search efforts became weekly check-ins and monthly status updates. Detectives retired. New officers took over. The case file was passed from hand to hand, desk to desk, each time gathering a little more dust, becoming a little more forgotten. The warrant remained active. Technically, the Landers were still wanted fugitives. But practically speaking, the trail had gone cold. Here's what made this case nearly impossible to solve in the 1990s. The Landers had cash. They didn't need to use credit cards that could be traced. They didn't need to access bank accounts in their own names. They had time to plan. They had created new identities, social security numbers, documents, a complete backstory. This wasn't the work of amateurs. They weren't dangerous criminals. They weren't on the FBI's most wanted list. They were grandparents who loved their grandson. To anyone who met them, they seemed like a normal family. And most importantly, 5-year-old Ricky had no idea he'd been kidnapped. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't crying for his mother. He was just a child living with the grandparents who had always been a major part of his life. As far as he knew, everything was normal. Time is strange when someone you love goes missing. For Lisa Harter and her husband Richard, the days felt endless, but the years slipped by with terrifying speed. 1994 became 1995. The millennium turned. The world kept spinning, moving forward, even as they felt frozen in that moment of loss. Every birthday that passed was a reminder. Ricky would be 6 now. Now 7. Now 10. Now a teenager. Is he alive? Is he safe? Does he remember me? Does he know I never stopped looking? Lisa called the sheriff's department regularly. She asked if there were any updates, any new leads, any hope at all. The answer was always sympathetic and always the same, no, ma'am. We're so sorry. We're still looking. But were they? Really? In 2008, 14 years after Ricky disappeared, something devastating happened. The charges against Richard and Ruth Landers were dropped. Not because they'd been found. Not because the case was solved. But because time had passed, resources were limited, and the trail was colder than a Minnesota winter. The case officially went cold. For Lisa, this must have felt like a second death. First her son was taken. Now even the investigation was being abandoned. But she didn't stop hoping. She kept his photos. She kept his memory alive. She talked about him to anyone who would listen. She prayed. She waited. Somewhere out there, she believed her son was alive. She just had to find him. Minnesota, 1994 to 2012. While Lisa Harter searched, while investigators followed cold leads, while the case file gathered dust in an Indiana sheriff's office, Richard Wayne Landers Jr. was growing up. But he wasn't Richard anymore. He was Michael. Michael Jeff Landers. Or later, Michael Jeff Iddings, after his grandparents changed their names to Raymond Michael Iddings and Susan K. Iddings. Imagine being that child. 5 years old one day, driving away from everything you've ever known. You don't understand what's happening. Your grandparents tell you this is your new life now. These are your new names. This is where you live. At 5, you're malleable. Your memories are fuzzy. Did you have another life before this? Maybe. The details are unclear. Your grandparents tell you stories about who you are, where you came from, why you're here. You believe them because children believe their parents. Because why wouldn't you? The Iddings family, because that's who they were now, settled in central Minnesota. First in Long Prairie, a small town of fewer than 4,000 people. Later, the grandparents moved to nearby Browerville, even smaller, even quieter. These are farming communities. Places where people value privacy. Where a family that keeps to themselves isn't suspicious, it's normal. Where no one asks too many questions about your past because everyone has a right to start fresh. Michael went to school. He made friends. He played sports, did homework, went to birthday parties. He was, by all accounts, a normal kid growing up in small-town America. His grandparents, the people he called Grandma and Grandpa, though he may have called them Mom and Dad, raised him with genuine love. This is important to understand. Whatever their crime, whatever laws they broke, they cared for this child deeply. They made sure he went to school. They attended his games. They taught him to fish, to work hard, to be a good person. They gave him stability, structure, love. Was it kidnapping? Yes, legally, absolutely. But to Michael, it was just childhood. The years rolled by. Michael became a teenager, then a young man. In 2006, when he turned 18, something interesting happened. He legally changed his name. Not because his grandparents forced him to. He did it himself, voluntarily, at the age of majority. He changed his name from Michael Jeff Landers to Michael Jeff Iddings, taking his grandparents' assumed surname as his own. Think about what this means. At 18, he chose this identity. He embraced it. Whatever vague memories he might have had of life before Minnesota, they weren't strong enough to make him question his reality. He was Michael Iddings. That's who he'd been for 13 years. That's who he wanted to remain. By 2012, Michael was 24 years old. He had done everything right. He'd graduated high school. He'd worked various jobs in the Long Prairie area. He'd fallen in love with a woman named Bobby. They'd gotten married. He and Bobby lived on the same property as his grandparents, not unusual in rural communities where land is plentiful and families stay close. He was building a life. He and Bobby were expecting a child. Michael's world was complete. He had family, love, stability, a future. He had no idea that 500 miles away in Indiana, his biological mother had never stopped searching for him. He had no idea that his social security number, the one he used for work, for taxes, for his marriage license, was a beacon that would eventually lead investigators right to his door. He had no idea that the life he'd built on solid ground was actually built on sand. And the tide was coming in. Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest consequences. In September 2012, Richard Harter, Lisa's husband, Ricky's stepfather, was cleaning out old files. Maybe he was organizing, downsizing, preparing for a move. Maybe he was just tidying up. He found something in a drawer or a box, a small piece of paper that had been sitting there for nearly 2 decades. A social security card. His missing stepson's social security card, issued before the boy disappeared. Most people would have kept it as a memento, a painful reminder of what was lost. Richard Harter did something different. He brought it to the Indiana State Police. "I know it's been 18 years, he might have said. "I know the case is closed. But I was wondering, is there anything you can do with this?" Detective, name redacted for privacy, let's call him Detective Matthews, took the social security card and listened to the hardest story. 18 years. A 5-year-old boy taken by his grandparents. A custody dispute that ended in abduction. A cold case that had broken a family's heart. Detective Matthews could have filed the report and moved on. Cold cases from 1994 rarely get solved. The Landers could be anywhere. They could be dead. The trail was ice cold. But something made him try. Maybe it was the hope in Lisa Harter's eyes. Maybe it was the challenge. Maybe it was just good police work. He took that social security number and ran it through databases. And that's when something extraordinary happened. The number came back active. Someone was using Richard Wayne Landers Jr.'s social security number. Not for identity theft. Not for fraud. But for legitimate employment. Someone with the same date of birth as the missing child. Someone in Long Prairie, Minnesota. Detective Matthews started digging deeper. He contacted law enforcement in Minnesota. He pulled employment records. He found tax filings. He discovered that the person using this social security number was now a 24-year-old man who went by the name Michael Jeff Landers. Michael Jeff Landers. Not quite hiding the original surname. Not quite revealing it either. Then he found something even more interesting. Nearby, in Browerville, Minnesota, there was a couple in their late 60s named Raymond Michael Iddings and Susan K. Iddings. The detective pulled driver's license photos. He compared them to old photos of Richard E. and Ruth A. Landers from 1994. Even after 18 years, even with aging and time, the resemblance was unmistakable. He'd found them. Now comes the delicate part. How do you tell someone their entire life is a lie? Law enforcement in Minnesota made contact with Michael Landers in late 2012. They asked him to come in for questioning. Routine, they said. Nothing to worry about. Michael came voluntarily. Why wouldn't he? He hadn't done anything wrong. He was living his life, working his job, starting his family. He sat in that interview room with no idea what was coming. The detectives asked him about his social security number. Where did he get it? When was he born? Who were his parents? Michael answered honestly. The number had always been his. He was born July 29, 1989. Note, this would have been his actual birth date in 1989, making him 5 in 1994. His grandparents, Raymond and Susan Iddings, had raised him. The detectives looked at each other. Then they showed him the photograph. A 5-year-old boy in 1994. Dark hair, innocent eyes, a child's smile. Do you recognize this child? Michael studied it. Maybe something flickered in his memory. Maybe he saw his own face staring back at him from 2 decades ago. That's you, they told him. Your name is Richard Wayne Landers Jr. You were taken from Indiana in 1994. You've been missing for 18 years. Your mother never stopped looking for you. Try to imagine that moment. Everything you think you know about yourself, your name, your history, your family, is suddenly wrong. The people you call Grandma and Grandpa, they kidnapped you. They fled across state lines. They lived under false names. They built your entire childhood on a foundation of lies and false documents. Your identity? A fabrication. Your memories? Carefully constructed fiction. Your mother? Not the woman who raised you, but a stranger in Indiana who has spent 18 years hoping you're alive. How do you process that? How does your brain even begin to make sense of it? Michael was in shock. Disbelief. Denial. This had to be a mistake. His grandparents were good people. They loved him. They couldn't. But the evidence was irrefutable. The DNA would confirm it. The paper trail was clear. The timeline matched perfectly. Michael Jeff Iddings learned that he was actually Richard Wayne Landers Jr. And nothing would ever be the same. Law enforcement went to Browerville next. Raymond and Susan Iddings, Richard and Ruth Landers, were now in their late 60s. They'd had 18 years of peace, 18 years of raising their grandson, 18 years of looking over their shoulders waiting for this day. When the police knocked on their door, they knew. They must have known. The detective asked them directly, "Did you take your grandson from Indiana in 1994? And after 18 years of hiding, of running, of living under false names, they confessed. Yes. They had taken him. They had believed, truly believed, that they were saving him from an inadequate mother. They had believed they were doing the right thing. They loved him. They had raised him well. They had given him a good life. Did that justify the kidnapping? Did that make it right? They couldn't answer that. Maybe there was no answer. In early 2013, the case was referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Interstate abduction of a child is a federal crime. The statute of limitations had not expired. Charges could be filed. Richard and Ruth Landers were in their late 60s. They had no prior criminal record beyond this one act. They had raised their grandson with love and care. He had turned out well, a married man with a child on the way, employed, stable, happy. But they had also committed a serious crime. They had violated a court order. They had taken a child from his legal guardian. They had lived as fugitives for 18 years. What was justice in this case? Prosecutors faced an impossible situation. On one hand, a crime had been committed. On the other hand, the victim, now a 24-year-old man, stood firmly on his grandparents' side. Michael Landers, because he continued to use that name, that identity, made his position clear publicly. Through social media, through statements, he defended the people who had raised him. His wife Bobby posted on Facebook, and I'm paraphrasing here based on reports, the grandparents were in the right. They kept him safe. They gave him a wonderful life. They protected him. Michael himself expressed love and loyalty to his grandparents. He forgave them. More than that, he didn't believe they needed forgiveness. In his view, they had saved him. And what about Lisa Harter? For 18 years, she had searched. She had hoped. She had never given up on her son. Now he was found, alive, healthy, an adult with his own family. But he didn't know her. Didn't remember her. And, if reports were accurate, didn't particularly want a relationship with her. Can you imagine that pain? The joy of knowing your child is alive, mixed with the agony of knowing he doesn't see you as his mother? The authorities confirmed what Lisa already knew, her son was safe. He was an adult now. Reuniting with his birth mother was entirely up to him. She couldn't force a relationship. She couldn't reclaim the 18 years that had been stolen. She couldn't undo the bond between Michael and his grandparents. All she could do was wait and hope that he might, someday, want to know her. In the end, the specifics of what happened legally remain somewhat unclear in public records. Some reports suggest charges were considered but ultimately not filed, possibly due to Michael's forgiveness and the complexity of the situation. What we do know is this: by 2013, the grandparents were not imprisoned. They continued living in Minnesota. Michael continued his relationship with them. The family, all of them, including Lisa, had to figure out how to move forward. This case forces us to ask difficult questions. Was this a kidnapping or a rescue? Were Richard and Ruth Landers criminals or protectors? Did they steal Michael's childhood or save it? Is love a justification for breaking the law? Does the end, Michael's seemingly happy life, justify the means? What about Lisa Harter's rights as a mother? What about her 18 years of grief? There are no easy answers. Different people, looking at the same facts, come to different conclusions. Some see grandparents who committed a terrible crime, no matter their intentions. They see a mother robbed of her child. They see a boy denied his true identity. Others see a child who might have struggled in his mother's care, who thrived with his grandparents. They see a young man who credits them with giving him a good life. They see love, not crime. Both perspectives hold truth. Both perspectives miss something. That's what makes this case so extraordinary and so troubling. The Richard Landers case isn't unique. It's unusual, yes. 18 years is a long time. But family abductions happen far more often than stranger abductions. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, hundreds of thousands of children are abducted by family members every year in the United States. These aren't random kidnappings. They're custody disputes that turn criminal. They're parents or grandparents who believe, rightly or wrongly, that they're protecting a child. Most of these cases resolve within days or weeks. Children are found. Families go to court. Custody arrangements are modified or enforced. But some, like Richard's case, go unsolved for years or even decades. What solved this case was something simple: a social security number. In 1994, tracking someone across state lines was nearly impossible. No social media. No digital footprint. No GPS. If you had cash and false documents, you could disappear. But Richard E. and Ruth Landers made one crucial mistake: they gave their grandson a real social security number. Probably they had to, for school enrollment, for medical care, for all the things a child needs growing up. That number became a thread leading investigators straight to them. Today, in 2012 and beyond, disappearing is much harder. We leave digital traces everywhere: social media posts, credit card transactions, cell phone pings, security camera footage. Technology that makes privacy nearly impossible also makes finding the missing much easier. One of the most fascinating aspects of this case is the question of identity. Who was the young man found in Minnesota in 2012? Legally, he was Richard Wayne Landers Jr., the name he was given at birth. But psychologically, emotionally, experientially, he was Michael Jeff Landers, later Iddings. That's who he'd been for 18 of his 24 years. That's the life he remembered. That's the identity he chose to keep even after learning the truth. This raises profound questions. What makes us who we are? Is it the name on our birth certificate? Is it our memories? Is it the people who raise us? Is it the life we build for ourselves? If someone has no memory of their real identity, if they're happy with the life they've known, does it matter that it was built on deception? For Michael, clearly, the answer was no. He chose to remain Michael. He chose to stay connected to the grandparents who raised him. He chose the identity he'd known over the one he'd been born with. That was his right as an adult. But it was a right that came at an enormous cost, paid primarily by his biological mother. As of the last public reports from 2013, Michael Landers was living in Minnesota with his wife Bobby and their child. He maintained his relationship with his grandparents. He had limited or no relationship with his biological mother and stepfather in Indiana. Richard E. and Ruth Landers remained in Minnesota, apparently not facing criminal charges due to the complex circumstances and their grandson's forgiveness. Lisa Harter got her answer: her son was alive, but perhaps not the reunion she'd dreamed of for 18 years. The case file, finally, was closed. But the questions it raised remain open. The story of Richard Landers is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's not a clear-cut case of villain and victim. It's a story about the complexity of family, the gray areas of justice, and the impossible situations that sometimes arise when good people make terrible decisions. It reminds us that love can be both beautiful and destructive, that parents and grandparents can genuinely believe they're doing the right thing even when they're breaking the law, and that the children caught in the middle pay the highest price, no matter the outcome. Most importantly, it reminds us that in missing persons cases, found doesn't always mean resolved. Finding someone doesn't erase the years they were gone. It doesn't heal all wounds. It doesn't answer all questions. Sometimes, being found is just the beginning of a new, more complicated story. This has been the Found Files. If this story moved you, if it made you think, hit that like button and drop a comment below. What do you think? Were the grandparents justified? Should they have faced charges? Could you forgive them if you were Michael? Could you accept the outcome if you were Lisa? And please, subscribe to this channel. We bring you the most extraordinary found persons cases, stories of hope, survival, identity, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Stories that remind us that sometimes, against all odds, the missing come home. Until next time, stay safe, hold your loved ones close, and never, never stop hoping.